one. Now, Judy, in terms of the interviews, and as you know, with this series that we've been doing, the special, we've had an opportunity to talk to a number of people, such as Linda Lazarovich from K9 ProWear, who's referencing your book, Al Gordon, of course, who you're very familiar with. And in fact, I want to talk about Al's brief interview with him today. And I'm going to make reference, Judy, to a poll that we are running now, where we asked the question, or we made the statement, winning bidders for government tenders are decided before the RFP is issued in 90% of the cases. Does this surprise you? That was the question we posed based upon the fact that Al Gordon has indicated that, look, 90% of the time, especially as his role as a chief player with Governor Cuomo's group, when Governor Cuomo was in charge, obviously, or governor, obviously, of New York, he made that statement that 90% of the bids are decided before the RFP is issued. The response to this was even more surprising because 59% of those who have submitted their thoughts on that issue said they were not surprised. 23% said they were surprised, and 18% saying we don't pursue government contracts. Now, my initial thing right off the top there is based on those statistics, at best, it looks as if the government is really only accessing or engaging 25% of the potential supply base. So right off the bat, what does this tell you? First of all, is Al right? Is that figure accurate or close to being accurate within a certain percentage points? What does that tell you if it is?
First, I would express it differently, and I would also make a distinction between how things work at state and local, which is typically a more parochial environment and decision-making process than federal. But 90% is a good number, but exactly what happens at the 90% point is important. I would characterize it differently. Think about the Winter Olympics. Think about the winning bobsleigh team. They're not the guys who just happen to have a really good graphite sled strapped to the top of the Volvo and were driving past Whistler on the day of the competition. No. They found teaming partners, tried them out, had auditions, looked at the competition, did trial runs, practiced, trained, so that 90% of what went into deciding who the winner was happens before they cross the starting line. So I want you to encourage people to think about government contracting as the business Olympics. It's that so much of the effort, the work, the training, the preparation happens before the RFP drops, before the formal crossing of the starting line. So that's how I would characterize it. It's very important.
If I could just interrupt, because you see, you've raised an interesting point here with the verification, but putting into the context you have. When you present these types of findings to procurement professionals within the public sector, their initial reaction is one of, well, it's not fixed. We're not doing anything wrong. It's almost as if they're not disputing the numbers, but disputing what it actually infers, which is saying if 90% of the RFPs are decided if the winners are decided before the RFP is issued, or the starting line, some of them take it as the fact is that implies that there is something untoward happening, which isn't the case, is it?
That's correct. And so it's important for people to speak clearly and accurately about what goes into submitting a winning proposal. And 90% of the preparation that goes into a winning proposal happens before the RFP drops, which is, say, long before 30 days before RFP closes. So rather than, I would really encourage people who want to understand government contracting and advocate for fairness, and I think we all do, to realize that the onus is on vendors to realize how much preparation they need to do long before what is characterized as the formal procurement process begins. That's how I would characterize it.
Now, you see, what you're talking about sort of leads back into our discussion regarding Linda Lazarovich, where she had indicated that, she has found or carved out a unique service, K9 ProWear, protective wear for dogs, obviously, that has given her a competitive advantage. This goes back to what you say in the book as well, is that it's up to the vendor and suppliers to understand where their strength is and where they should be building the relationships to pursue government opportunities. Is it safe to say that part of the misconception or disconnect is that the vendors don't actually do their homework and that they have the erroneous belief that a tender is the same thing as an opportunity? In other words, just because you're active doesn't mean you're being productive.
Yes. If you don't know the buyer and you don't know the incumbent and you don't know the budget and you don't know the history, and the first time you hear about an opportunity is electronically and with less than 30 days to go, you're not doing marketing. Let's be real clear. What you're doing is market research. And the effort you put into that proposal, what you're most likely to get out of it is maybe the opportunity to get a debriefing afterward and find out what you could have done better. Really important. Government is not a big loading dock where you just dump off your stuff and it gets vacuumed into a system. You're selling to individuals, which takes me to the principle that we talked about in our series last year. Focus or go broke. Companies really have to choose no more than 3 agencies, or even in a big agency like Health and Human Services and National Institutes of Health, 3 institutes that they clearly solve a critical problem for and go deep rather than go broad.
See, I'm automatically reminded of what you'd said, is that vendors should win buyer preference legitimately and transparently. That's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And to get on the right side of that 90% of the effort, people do business with people they know, people do business with people they like, people do business with people they trust, and that happens through building relationships a long time before the RFP drops and by participating in the many kinds of pre-RFP activities that experienced people in the marketplace realize let them participate in shaping the specifications.
So now this goes to a part of this question. These poll results obviously reflect the fact, and again, it's still very early, but it's an interesting trending. But these poll results, I think, would reflect a misunderstanding of all parties. The misunderstanding on the part of the vendor as to that very point you just raised. On the government side of the equation, is it that governments are loath to talk about this within the context that you're presenting, simply because it's just much easier to post on a Merck's or a GSA and say, hey, we dotted the I's and crossed the T's. I mean, I'm reminded when I talked to a senior executive from Treasury Canada who is going through a selection and the purported savings that their decision had been made to automate their procurement platform. When I raised the issue that, look, I've gone through these numbers and there's absolutely no way these numbers can be achieved, this individual's response was, that may be correct and you are probably right. But from our standpoint, we followed policy and dotted the I's and crossed the T's in terms of the RFP, and so that was our focus. I mean, is that part of the contributing factor to that disconnect of understanding?
It is, because government officials are typically focused on rules, regulations, and process. Remember the 7 steps we talked about in government contracting. Strategy and focus, that's all up to the company at the front end. Process, that's what the government buyers are all about. That's what they talk about. That's where the concept, misguided or incomplete though it may be, at a level playing field, all comes together. Process is what they're all about, and government buyers often don't really think too much about what are all the other things, the other kinds of instances of contact they've had with government buyers long before they post something on Merck's or post something on eBay and say we want something. They don't think about all of the other things that a company has done to contact them before the actual competition opens. They don't think about that as the process. They think about that as outside the process. It may be outside the process for the government buyer, but it's critical to success for the company.
I have to ask this. Does that, what you've just talked about, is that where the automation of, let's say, a Merck's and a tendering process, and I forget the term Al Gordon used, but you can, with these systems and GSAs, you can pre-program in keywords, so that whenever there's a requirement based on keywords, you automatically get notified of the RFP. I mean, have these systems in many ways automated what is already a poor process and detracted from focusing on what needs to be done to fix it. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. And the answer may be yes in part. Just because you get an automated notice of a requirement doesn't mean, if that's the first time you hear about it as an automated notice, you've missed the boat, you've missed the opportunity to find out more about what's really behind that requirement, the things that are motivating the purchase, the things that are driving the decision, how they liked or didn't like the incumbent, all of those things. Some purchases are for commodity and they're going to be low price. Somebody needs Post-it notes or they need a chair. Even those kinds of simple purchases, there are things you can find out more about. Large, complex requirements, you absolutely need to be meeting the buyers ahead of time. In places like the Commonwealth of Virginia, for example, their EVA system, I've heard vendors say that it's really quite difficult to go and meet any kind of buyer or program manager in advance. They really want to have a completely sterile system. But you can believe that experienced vendors are still making contact with buyers through established relationships. People still do business with people. So automating a process is an illusion to say that that's been taken care of and made universally accessible and it's all clean. This is still the ultimate relationship market.
You see, it's fascinating what you said, because I just interviewed Ian Burden, who was the one of the key people driving the e-procurement Scotland initiative. I interviewed him this morning from the UK. And he's saying one of the biggest mistakes that government makes is they believe that automation is the magic bullet that will improve government procurement. And he said automation is a tool that needs to be leveraged, but only after you have an effective process of engagement in place. Only after you have, and I think it's sort of speaking to what you're saying as well, is that a lot of people on the government side look at automation as being a problem solver versus a tool that is leveraged to address a solution in process that has to be defined before you actually automate. I mean, that's really what you're saying.
In order to have an effective automated process and still make it fair, I think there still has to be other information available, and that varies by country. The United States is definitely better than some, that can allow vendors to also make contact, get to know program managers, and find out more about the people side before the electronic gears go into motion.
Okay, so the best way to sum it up, we just have a few moments left. The best way to sum it up, tell me if I'm right on this, is that vendors, do your homework and be strategic in your thinking. Just don't believe that responding to an RFP is the same thing as a true opportunity. On the side of the government, recognize the fact that perhaps you have to get away from that belt with suspenders mindset and focus on the fact that you really do have to build rapport and a relationship with your vendors and go outside of the framework of just relying on technology and putting a bid out there. Because if you're just sending out bids through an RFP process, are you really doing an effective engagement? I mean, is that a safe starting point, at least, from both sides?
I would agree with you both that government buyers are going to have a higher trust level and better performance from their vendors when they also buttress the electronic process with relationships beforehand, and that vendors are going to be more successful when they figure out, is selling to government good for my business, and focus instead of going an awful lot closer to broke than they really need to. Because to come back to your question at the beginning, John, remember the 18 to 20% of people who say, I don't sell to government. Remember this. Selling to government is not for everybody. It's not good for every company. So I wouldn't say that the government is missing that bottom 20% of the supply base. There may be some in there that could be good vendors and are discouraged for some reason or self-selecting out. There may be very good reasons why some of that 20% are self-selecting themselves out. The fertile ground for new suppliers is the 25% who go, what? It's all decided beforehand? Because these people are legitimately making an effort and are surprised that the unwritten rules of the game aren't getting through to them. And that's where things like your show and the resources you bring to bear can help.
And to end, that's why your book is probably a great read for both sides of the equation, whether you're a government buyer or a vendor looking to do business with the government.
Thanks.